Painting 1 students, welcome. We are going to work on our project on value. First thing you're going to need is your 9 by 12 canvas, and we're going to start by drawing in the format for this project. So we need to use our metal straight edge and make some measurements. We're going to measure and make some marks with our pencil, very light marks, and we're going to remember, you start your measurements with the first notch on the ruler. Be sure you're not using the end of the ruler if your measurements don't start there. You're going to make a notch at 1.5 and 10.5 on the bottom, the very bottom, and the same thing on the top, making sure your ruler is lined up properly. You'll make a mark at 1.5 and 10.5. Okay, we're going to then connect those dots and line your ruler up with those two dots. And again, doesn't need to be a dark line, it can be a light line, and that gives us our canvas divided up into 3 sections. Line up with those 2 lines and measure across. Now on this bottom section here, we're going to do further measurements. We're going to divide it into 1.5 inch squares. So again, line up your ruler for measurements. You're going to make a mark at the very bottom here, 1.5, 3, 4.5, 6, and 7.5. And then up on this little line that you drew, same thing. Get your ruler lined up and make tiny little marks at 1.5. Whoop, I almost got that one wrong. 3, 4.5, 6, and 7.5. We're then inside of this bar down here. Go ahead and connect those dots. Okay, so we're going to have 2 different value bars here. One is going to be divided into sections. On the bottom, it'll be divided and have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different values. And on the top, we're going to blend and have the same 6 values, but they are going to blend together, and we're going to practice a technique for blending paint called wet on wet blending. So that's our first step for setting up our project. Next thing we need to do is we're going to make a painting in here that will be instructive about the blending technique, but also about how we can use value to create the illusion of 3 dimensions in a sphere. And what we'll be doing is painting what's called the Chiaroscuro sphere in that blank area. This is a pencil rendering of the Chiaroscuro sphere, but what we see here is the light from a single light source that is directed onto a sphere, and it creates 6 stages of value. We can see a highlight, an area of light, area of shadow. In the middle of the shadow, we see what's called the core shadow, or the darkest value in the sphere. Below that, down here, is a dark middle tone that's called reflected light. That's where light actually bounces up off the table back into the bottom of the sphere, and then the sphere has a cast shadow. Now, this is the chiaroscuro sphere. This is a map of what we just looked at. So we can take this and we can break it down into these value patterns. Now you see the value patterns are blended into each other by the finish of this, but we begin with a kind of a map of how these things are breaking down. And so if we have a light source coming from the top right down here, we see we have a highlight. If we drew in our light source and we have these lines that indicated the light coming down from the light source, we'd see that our areas of shadow start where the sphere begins to round away from the light source. So our area of shadow starts right there. And then in the middle of our kind of shadow is this core shadow that is the darkest part of our sphere. These lines also would give us an indication of where this cast shadow would need to end. The size of this. The cast shadow is an elliptical shape. So it's a circle in perspective. It's not an oval. It doesn't flatten out anywhere. It remains continuously round. And note that the sphere kind of sits not at the edge of it, but the sphere kind of sits in the middle of this kind of puddle of shadow, if you will. So this is called our chiaroscuro sphere, and it introduces us to the basic breakdown of kind of the 6 stages of value when we are observing light on a 3-dimensional form. We have highlight, light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. A little closer view of that. That's the map of the chiaroscuro sphere. And next up, we are going to draw that map onto our format here in the middle, in this middle part. So we have this to go by, and looks like I've already made a mess. Ignore that. So we have this center area, and we're going to start to draw this. So first thing we need to do is draw this circle. And one of the tricks to drawing a circle, you put your pencil down, keep staring at that spot, and just allow the pencil to run around. And I will do this very lightly, and maybe I don't have it absolutely perfect at first, but slowly I'll sneak up on the circle that I'm looking for. I'm pretty close, and that's about the size you want. You want it to be fairly large inside of this format. Then, if we imagine our light source coming down, we'll kind of get some idea of where our so the light source is kind of beginning somewhere up here and sending down these light beams, we can kind of imagine here. And what we're going to do at this point is, we kind of note the place where the sphere begins to turn away from the light source. It's a little higher on the left side, a little lower on the right side, because the light is oriented from over here. And so we're going to then essentially draw another circle that kind of touches at these 2 spots. We need this to be kind of a rounded shape because these lines are kind of reiterating the roundness of the sphere. We don't want this area to flatten out. We want it to be rounded. Okay, so that's, at this point we've drawn in our area of light. And the area of light is roughly 2/3 of the entire area of the sphere. So it's a large portion of the sphere. In the middle of this area of light, we will draw in a little circle. Stay very light, because you don't want to have to fight with the graphite and get rid of the graphite as you go. But this little circle here is going to be the highlight of that sphere. So at this point, we've drawn the initial circle. We drew another circular shape where we measured kind of where the where it needed to touch this circle, we drew another one, which is the area of light. And in the middle of that, we drew another little circle that is the highlight. Now, down in this area of shadow, we've got to put in our core shadow. So that is an interesting shape, because it is maybe analogous to oh boy, I made a mess again. It's analogous to a crescent moon shape, where it gets thinner. It gets thinner as it gets closer to the edges, and it gets thicker towards the middle, and then thinner again. So that the core shadow we're about to draw in is this kind of band in the middle of the area of shadow that looks like a crescent moon shape or a crooked smile, potentially. So in the middle of our area of shadow here, I'm going to try to put in where my core shadow needs to be. It's going to kind of be centered in this area of shadow, and sometimes I have to, again, just like drawing the sphere, I kind of have to feel it out, get the roundness appropriate. And it's centered, remember, it's centered in this area of shadow. Okay, and you can kind of see here, core shadow now. Wider here, thinner up here. Very important for it to round up to that edge. It's thinner, rounds up there, thinner, and rounds up right there. So that's our core shadow at its thickest point here, opposite of the light source. But this kind of band that runs in the middle of the area of shadow. We had our area of shadow kind of defined right here. So we have our shadow area breakdown kind of sketched in at this point, where we have three different delineated value areas. We have core shadow, we have the area of shadow, and then we have this area, which is the reflected light. That's where the light is bouncing off the surface this sphere is sitting on and back up into the sphere. Now, our light, the lines we drew for our kind of how the light is behaving here, would give us a cast shadow that probably is going to extend off our page. So if I actually drew it kind of the appropriate size, it would be off the, and that's often a good idea to go ahead and draw, even if it's not on the surface of the canvas, but sometimes it gives you a better sense of the shape that you are drawing to have the rest of the drawing kind of extend off the canvas. And I put some paper down so that I wouldn't make a mess of the table that I'm working on. So at this point, we've mapped in our chiaroscuro sphere. We've got all of our value, 6 stages of value kind of mapped out. We put in the sphere, then we put in our area of light, our highlight, then we had our area of shadow, and we put in our core shadow, and then our cast shadow. And so at this point, we have all 6 stages of value mapped out. You want to check and make sure you've got your shapes mapped out appropriately. There are 1, 2, 3 bands of value down in this area of shadow. Your area of light is roughly 2/3 of the overall area of the sphere, and these lines all need to round similar to the edges of the circle you have here, so that this three-dimensional illusion really works once we start painting into this form. So we have mapped out our our painting at this point. The next thing we need to do for setting up, and I've kind of already, for the sake of time, got mine worked out, but we need to set up a monochromatic palette. So your palette needs to have 6 stages of value. And you can see here I put down a piece of the palette paper, and I put white at the top. So you have your white paint, and you have a burnt umber color, your dark brown color. So I put down white at the top, and I put down burnt umber at the bottom, and then I mixed middle tones off of those two. This middle tone, or number 2 middle tone, is in fact similar to an off-white, so not very far from white at all. And then we're trying to get other middle tones that kind of transition from white to darker and darker values, and hopefully you can see the shift in values there pretty well. Your darkest tone, number 6, is just the straight burnt umber, while number 5, it has some white mixed in, and then we kind of transition to lighter and lighter tones. And these are the different values that we will use for our 9x12 canvas. First thing we're going to do, once you've got your palette mixed, it's going to take you a little while, and remember that you put a lot of work into mixing these tones, and give it the occasional spritz. Don't forget your water bottle, and to keep these paints active. Mixing your palette, obviously you're using a palette knife, not a brush, or else you're just going to waste a lot of paint. It's going to get eaten up by the brush. Okay, so we have our palette mixed. It may take you a minute to work on that, and if you're kind of following along with the video, you might even pause it and try to get your palette mixed, and then check your palette. Make sure you got a good gradation of tones, and that you have a light tone that's close to white, and then middle tones that shift subtly from one to the next. At this point, you need to get paint brushes. Once you got your palette, set up and mixed, you'll need some paint brushes, and you'll need different supplies. The paint brushes we're going to use at this point are the synthetic hair brushes, those softer brushes, because they allow us to put down the paint a little more smoothly and with a little more delicacy than the light handle brushes we got, which are natural hair brushes, a little more rough. So at this point, we're going to kind of reiterate something we've done previously, and so we're going to paint just the value bars, and we're just painting hard edge shapes. Remember, we have the value bar on the bottom that's going to be divided, and so we'll be painting that very similar to an earlier project where we're painting flat hard edge shapes that have crisp edges between them. And then when we get up to this value bar up here, we're going to work on wet blending, which is a technique that allows us to make the paint transition smoothly from one value to the next. So to get started down here, I'll just begin on this side and paint in my darkest tone. I'm just using one of the flats. To note the kind of quality of the paint here, the burnt umber, I'm painting it in first here. We're going to have a nice crisp edge, so we're going to try to pull one of those crisp lines, straight crisp lines along the edges between these shapes. But the burnt umber is the most transparent paint that we have. So it sometimes you have to butter it on real thick, or you have to kind of go back later and put a second coat on to get it opaque, putting it down here. Some folks will tape off this line to make it neat, but we're going to go back in and paint this entire format, so even errors like this will be painted out by the end of the project, and we can kind of reassert this straight line once we start painting in our sphere painting. So we're going to do flat shapes across here, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to pause the video while I fill in the rest of those, and then we will work on the wet on wet blending that's going to happen in the top value bar. Okay, as you can see here, I've got my values painted in down here, what's called our divided value bar, and make sure your paint is flatly applied, no evidence of transparency and brush marks, and that there are crisp edges created between the different values. Now we're going to use our other bar that we initially drew in, and we're going to do our blended value bar. Now the values down here need to correspond with the values that are up there, but in this case they're going to blend together. And what we're working with here is a technique called wet on wet blending. And for wet on wet blending, you're going to have 3 brushes active. It's a 3-brush technique. It's about blending wet acrylic paints together, and it really it requires you to move quickly so that you can avoid the paint drying. You need all the paint available for this technique wet, so it will move around. Once the paint dries, this technique won't work anymore. So we got to kind of move rapidly as we go. So in this bar, we're gonna kind of do the same thing we did there, but like just noted, this is a technique that requires you to have 3 brushes active at a time. And so in this case, I'll get 3 of my flat brushes here. And so one brush will be dedicated to the darkest color, one value, one will be dedicated to the the middle tone, and then one is, and I'm going to use the largest flat that I have here as a blending brush. So it's how you're going to blend between those 2 values there. So I'm going to kind of look, I'm going to use this as a guide here to kind of where my darkest value needs to be, and I'm going to start to paint it down similar to how I did with the initial block there. I'm going to put it down here, and you need a good amount of paint. You don't want to use a small amount of paint on this because it you need paint to move around. So I'll put down a fairly good amount, and I'm pretty close to where my block is down there. I don't want an insane amount of paint down here, but I want enough that it can move around. Now sometimes some folks who do this technique, they'll give their canvas just a light spritz of paint, so there's water down there that can move around. So I have, at this point, I have one brush that's dedicated to my darkest tones, and now I'm going to get my middle tone here, my darker middle tone. Again, I'm using a flat, using my 3 largest flat brushes. I'm going to start putting my middle tone down here, similar to how I did down there. Remember, they're supposed to kind of correspond and line up here. There's my middle tone. And I'm going to paint right up to that line, same way we did in the above divided value bar. And I'm going to clean up that line later on. I already made a mess to start this thing, but I'll load up this brush, get a nice amount of paint there. Now I have my 2 brushes dedicated to my 2 colors, and that's in case I need to go back and reassert one of those colors if the blending goes too far one direction or another. But at this point, I'm going to get my blending brush. I'm put it in the water, and then I don't want it wet, but I want it damp. So I can kind of feel it on my hand. Just kind of, it has some water on it, so it softens it up a little bit, and it has some water to move things around. But I'll move these brushes over here, and then for wet on wet, at this point, this is our blending brush, and we want it to be completely empty of paint and a little bit damp, and then we're just going to kind of use it to kind of pull the paint and kind of pull one color over, another color over, so we don't see a division between the 2. And those two mix together pretty nicely. The darker tone, this is a pretty dark middle tone. I'll reassert it just a little bit because it's looks like the darker value creeped over just a little bit. Hopefully the camera is picking it up pretty well, what we got. Let's see if we can get it down a little closer there and see how the two values blend together. It looks fairly dark in this light. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my brush I had dedicated to my darkest tone, since that blending looks fairly satisfactory at this point. I'm going to change. I'm going to dedicate this brush now to the third middle tone, third darkest. And I'm going to start to apply that in here to correspond where it is up above. And again, getting it in there and having enough paint that it's going to have the opportunity to kind of move around. And then, again, my blending brush, which I actually need to clean off a little bit now. So I have one brush now dedicated to each tone that I'm using, the second and third darkest middle tones. And then I have this blending brush that is moist, not wet, and I'm going to start to drag it. At this point, I'm able to keep all my kind of brush marks parallel, and that seems to help get the blending to work. And I just kind of go back and forth and try to get the two colors to kind of fade in to each other. And you can see we're getting a pretty good blending happening at this point. And so I'm again going to do the same kind of thing, where I'm going to take my brush that I have dedicated to my second darkest value right now, and I'm going to switch it over. I cleaned out my blending brush real quick, so I'll have it available for this next one. But I'm going to take this brush that's been dedicated to the darkest color. I'm going to move it up and dedicate it to that color after I wash it out. Obviously, as you set up for this, you need to make sure you have a cup of water available. And so now this brush, I'm going to take my middle tone here, trying to make sure things are staying kind of corresponding with what's up above. The more white that's mixed in with a color, the more opaque it gets. And so these colors or these values are pretty strong. The term for when you're painting with just a single color and white, and you make this kind of gradation of darker and lighter colors, this is called a monochromatic painting. Mono meaning one, chromatic meaning color. So this is a monochromatic painting. For learning the wet on wet blending technique, having just a single color that's just mixed with white, it's a good place to start. You're not having to mix a huge amount of colors, but you have some difference that you can kind of work through. So make sure your blending brush is moist, not wet. And then again, pull the brush through here, parallel strokes. You might see me kind of breaking the boundary of that line right there, and I'm okay with that, because I'm gonna go ahead and paint over that when we're working on the sphere. And pretty good. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to reassert this value just a tiny bit, push it over, this kind of transition. So that's where having the three brushes dedicated gives you the ability, if you're losing one value, to kind of go ahead and reassert it into the gradation. I'm going to do the same thing over here, so that I'm getting it transition. I'm not losing this brown. I am getting those areas of transition, but I don't want to totally lose my value there. I may be pushing this one a little far to the left now. I might need to go back in and reassert the other middle tone. But we want to make sure we see a transition occurring across the whole thing. Now I'm going to take my brush that was dedicated to this middle tone, and I'm going to dedicate it to my lightest middle tone, closest to white. Put that down here. Getting a fairly good amount of this paint down. And again, you know the drill. We're going to blend in between those two with the third brush. Nope, a little wet. I like to kind of test it out on my hand to make sure maybe a little bit of water comes off, but not a lot. Parallel strokes. And we want you really want kind of a slow, almost imperceptible transition, while still keeping the two values existent. But soft, somewhat of a soft. I'm bracing my hand on the table sometimes when I'm working on this, trying to keep soft pressure and just letting the transition just kind of slowly form. Moving back and forth, left and right. And final color here. Maybe I'll reassert this middle tone just a tiny bit. And then final one, we add absolute white. Remember, we want to see the correspondence here. I want to see that value directly below that. There, there, and there. And so now we're adding white. And I'll take care of some of my mess I made earlier. It may seem kind of weird to paint white paint over a white canvas, but obviously for a wet on wet technique we need wet paint to be active there, and so it's kind of a necessity. Also, the white of the canvas slightly different than the white of the paint, so it kind of just has to be done. Again, we're blending here. Just moist brush, moving left and right a little bit, and getting that slow transition. So now we have a nice blended value bar here and a divided value bar up there, and we have our 6 stages of value on our palette that correspond with the Chiaroscuro sphere. Reminder, when you're making your palette, it's just burnt umber and white, and then versions of that. There's no other colors mixed in here, and that's how we're going to begin our assignment. I'm going to cut here, and there will be a second video about the technique for painting the Chiaroscuro sphere.